The lecture hall at one of the country's most respected universities was packed that afternoon. Students, faculty, and a few curious members of the public filled the wooden seats, all waiting for Dr. Elias Thorne to take the stage. He was the kind of professor people whispered about. Brilliant, yes, but also famously sharp-tongued. His lectures on quantum physics weren't just lessons. They were performances full of dramatic pauses, chalkboard equations that stretched floor to ceiling, and occasional jabs at anyone he thought was wasting his time. That day's topic was quantum entanglement, the strange idea that two particles can be linked across space, so that what happens to one instantly affects the other, no matter how far apart they are. It's the kind of concept that bends your brain, and Thorne loved that. He paced the front of the room like a conductor, voice rising and falling as he explained how Einstein himself had called it spooky action at a distance. In the very back row, near the exit, a man in a plain black sweater and faded jeans sat quietly. He'd slipped in just before the lecture began, head slightly down, not drawing attention. Most people wouldn't have recognized him right away. Without the red carpet, the movie posters, or the flashing cameras, he just looked like someone who loved learning. But it was Keanu Reeves. He wasn't there for publicity. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there because for years, he'd been quietly fascinated by physics, by time, space, and the deep questions about how the universe works. He'd read books by real physicists, not just pop science summaries. He'd stayed up late watching recorded lectures online. He'd even struck up conversations with scientists at parties, not to impress them, but because he genuinely wanted to understand. To him, physics wasn't just math, it was poetry written in the language of reality. As Thorne spoke, Keanu listened closely, his eyes focused, fingers lightly tapping his knee in rhythm with the ideas unfolding. When the professor finally opened the floor for questions, a few hands went up, mostly from grad students asking about experimental setups or mathematical nuances. Then from the back, Keanu raised his hand slowly, almost hesitantly. Thorne squinted into the dim light. "Yes," he said, voice tinged with impatience. He wasn't used to questions from the back rows. Keanu stood, not for show, but out of respect. "You mentioned Bell's theorem," he began, his voice calm and steady, "and how it proves that quantum mechanics can't be explained by hidden local variables. But if consciousness plays a role in wave function collapse, as some interpretations suggest, doesn't that open the door to non-local effects that aren't just physical, but experiential? Like, could entanglement hint at something deeper about how we're connected?" The room went quiet. It wasn't the kind of question you'd expect from a casual listener. It showed he'd not only followed the lecture, but had thought about its philosophical edges, the kind of thinking that even some PhD students avoided. But Thorne didn't see depth. He saw a famous face asking a deep question, probably trying to sound smart in front of a crowd. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He let out a short laugh, more of a scoff, and adjusted his glasses. "Ah," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "Mr. Reeves, I should have guessed. Look, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but quantum mechanics isn't a script you can improvise. Bell's theorem is about measurable correlations, not cosmic vibes or movie star musings about connection. Stick to your action films. Real science requires rigor, not Hollywood intuition." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience. Some students glanced at each other, unsure whether to laugh or cringe. One young woman in the front row winced. Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply nodded once, as if to say, "Fair enough," and sat back down. His expression didn't change, no anger, no embarrassment, just quiet acceptance. He'd been underestimated before. He knew what it looked like when someone made up their mind about you before hearing a full sentence. Thorne moved on quickly, calling on another student, eager to return to what he considered serious discussion. But the moment lingered in the air like a missed note in a symphony. After the lecture ended, people filed out, chatting about the equations or the professor's latest jab at pop science. Keanu stayed in his seat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He wasn't hurt. He'd spent enough time in rooms full of skeptics, on film sets, in boardrooms, even in grief circles, to know that people often speak from their own limits, not yours. Still, it stung a little, not because of the insult, but because the question had come from a real place. He'd been trying to bridge two worlds, the cold precision of physics and the warm mystery of human experience. And instead of curiosity, He'd gotten a dismissal wrapped in arrogance. As he walked out of the building, autumn leaves swirling around his boots, he passed a group of undergrads debating the lecture. One of them spotted him and did a double take. "Wait, was that?" his friend whispered, but Keanu just gave a small, polite smile and kept walking, hands in his pockets, lost in thought. Back in the lecture hall, Thorne was erasing the board, humming to himself, already forgetting the exchange. To him, it had been a minor blip, a celebrity playing dress-up in a world he didn't belong to. He didn't know that Keanu had once spent an entire evening with a Nobel Prize-nominated physicist, not talking about fame or films but about the arrow of time and why the past feels so different from the future. He didn't know that Keanu carried a notebook filled with sketches of space-time diagrams and quotes from Carlo Rovelli. He didn't know any of it because he hadn't bothered to look, and that was the real tragedy of the moment. Not the insult itself, but the blindness behind it. The assumption that intelligence wears a lab coat or a degree on the wall. That curiosity has a uniform. That genius can't wear a worn sweater and sit quietly in the back just wanting to learn. Keanu reached the sidewalk and paused, looking up at the sky. Somewhere out there, particles were entangled, stars were burning, and time was flowing in ways no one fully understood. None of that cared about titles or reputations. The universe kept its secrets from everyone, professors and actors alike, and revealed them only to those willing to listen. Humbly, with open minds, he took a deep breath, turned down the street and disappeared into the city. Just another person walking home, carrying more inside him than anyone passing by could guess. After the lecture, most people hurried off, back to dorms, labs, or coffee shops, already forgetting the awkward moment in the back row. But not everyone. A graduate student lingered near the exit, pretending to tie her shoe while watching the man in the black sweater walk away. She'd recognized him right away, not because she was a movie fan, but because she'd seen an old interview where he talked about time, loss, and why he thought physics felt like philosophy with numbers. She'd been surprised when he asked that question. Not because celebrities don't ask smart things, some do, but because his question wasn't rehearsed. It came from real curiosity, and when the professor shut him down, she'd felt a knot in her stomach. Not just for him, but for how often that kind of thing happened in academia. Someone gets judged by their appearance, their job title, or their accent, and their actual thoughts never get a fair hearing. She caught up to him just outside the science building, under a big oak tree shedding golden leaves. "Excuse me," she said, a little breathless. I wanted to say your question was really thoughtful. Bell's theorem does open up those kinds of discussions, even if some people act like it doesn't." He turned, surprised, then smiled. Genuine, warm, the kind that reaches the eyes. "Thanks," he said. "I've been reading about it for a while. It's just hard to talk about without sounding like you're making stuff up." "No, it's not," she said quickly. "It's honest. And honestly, half the people in there wouldn't know the difference between Copenhagen and many worlds if their grant depended on it." He laughed softly. "I guess I forgot how tribal it can feel in those rooms." They stood there for a few minutes talking, not about movies or fame, but about quantum decoherence, the problem of measurement, and why time only seems to move forward. She was struck by how he listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak, but actually absorbing what she said, asking follow-ups that showed he'd already connected the dots in his head. At one point, he pulled a small notebook from his jacket, worn at the edges, pages filled with neat handwriting and little sketches of light cones and wave functions. "You keep notes?" she asked, amazed. "Yeah," he said, flipping to a page with a quote from a physicist about entropy and memory. "Helps me remember what I don't understand yet." She nodded slowly. "Most people pretend they get it all. You're the opposite," he shrugged. "Pretending doesn't help you learn." They talked until the afternoon light turned amber. Before they parted, she told him about a public talk coming up next week. A real one, not a lecture, with a physicist who actually welcomed big questions. He thanked her, said he'd try to come, and walked off down the path, hands in his pockets again, looking like any other thoughtful person on a quiet autumn day. Back inside the building, the professor was already in the faculty lounge, sipping black coffee and recounting the Keanu incident to a few colleagues. "You should have seen it," he said, chuckling. Asked something about consciousness and entanglement like he'd read one article on Wikipedia. I told him to stick to driving buses in his movies. The others laughed politely. One older professor, who'd been quietly grading papers in the corner, looked up. "You sure he was just guessing? I've heard he's actually quite well read." "Oh, come on," the professor scoffed. "It's Keanu Reeves. Nice guy, sure, but let's not pretend he's David Bohm." The room moved on to department politics, but the seed had been planted in more than one mind. Meanwhile, the graduate student couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. That night, she dug up an old podcast episode where the actor had spent nearly an hour discussing the nature of time with a theoretical physicist. He didn't just nod along, he asked sharp, precise questions. He referenced papers. He even admitted when he didn't know something, which, in her experience, was rarer among tenured faculty than among strangers on the street. She sent him a message through a mutual contact, a link to the podcast, and a note. "For what it's worth, you're not alone in wondering about this stuff." He replied the next morning. "Thanks. It means a lot. Most people think I'm joking." He wasn't joking. For years, he'd carried this quiet passion like a secret. After his early fame, when people only saw the action hero or the quiet guy from the internet memes, he'd stopped mentioning his interest in physics in interviews. Not because he was ashamed, but because it always got turned into a punchline. Keanu Reeves thinks he's Einstein. Or is John Wick solving Schrödinger's equation now? So he kept it to himself. Read books late at night. Watched lectures on his phone between takes. Once, on a film set in Germany, he stayed up until 3 a.m. talking with a local physics student who'd been hired as an extra. Just two people under the stars, wondering if the universe is finite or if time is an illusion. His curiosity wasn't about becoming an expert. It was about staying connected to wonder. In a life full of scripts, schedules, and expectations, physics was one place where he could just be a student again. No fame, no role to play, just a human trying to understand the mystery of existence. A few days later, he showed up at the public talk the grad student had mentioned. This time, he sat near the front, not hiding. The speaker was a woman known for making complex ideas feel human, tying quantum theory to everyday experience not to impress, but to invite. When Q&A opened, Keanu raised his hand again. This time, the room was different. Smaller, friendlier. The speaker recognized him but didn't make a show of it. He asked about the relationship between quantum indeterminacy and free will, not in a mystical way, but grounded in current debates. The physicist nodded thoughtfully. "That's one of the hardest questions we have," she said. "And honestly, I don't think we'll solve it in our lifetimes. But asking it? That's where science begins." Afterward, a few people came up to thank him, not for being famous, but for asking the kind of question that reminded them why they fell in love with science in the first place. One high school teacher said, "My students think physics is just formulas. You made it feel alive again." He just smiled. "It is alive. We're just trying to listen." Back at the university, the professor heard through the grapevine that Keanu had been at the talk, and that he'd held his own in a real discussion. He brushed it off. "Probably just got lucky with a soft crowd," he muttered. But a tiny doubt had crept in. What if he'd been wrong? What if the man he'd dismissed actually knew more than he let on? He didn't act on it, not yet. Pride is a heavy coat, hard to take off in public. But late that night, alone in his office, he typed the actor's name into the university library's journal database, half expecting nothing. Instead, he found references, indirect, but there, to correspondence with researchers, attendance at private symposiums, even a quiet donation to a program that brought physics demos to underserved schools. He stared at the screen for a long time, not with anger, but with something quieter. The first flicker of humility. And somewhere across town, Keanu sat in a quiet apartment, reading a new book about loop quantum gravity, a cup of tea cooling beside him. He didn't know the professor was rethinking things. He didn't need him to. He was just glad he'd found a few more people who asked questions without fear and answered without arrogance. Because in the end, that's all any of us want. To be heard, not judged. To wonder out loud and not be laughed at for it. And sometimes the deepest minds are the ones who speak the softest. Weeks passed. The campus settled back into its usual rhythm. Exams, coffee runs, late-night study sessions. The lecture hall incident faded from most people's minds, just another campus story. But not for everyone. The professor still thought about it, especially on quiet evenings when the weight of his own certainty felt heavier than usual. He hadn't apologized. Pride doesn't dissolve overnight, but something had shifted. He found himself listening more during department meetings, pausing before dismissing an idea just because it came from someone young or outside his circle. Then came the invitation. It arrived in his inbox on a rainy Tuesday, a private gathering at a hillside estate outside the city, hosted by a well-known tech founder with a passion for big ideas. The event brought together scientists, artists, philosophers, and a few unexpected guests to talk about consciousness, artificial intelligence, and the future of human understanding. Attendance was by invitation only. No press, no recordings, just honest conversation. The professor almost declined. He wasn't big on salons, as he called them. Too much talk, not enough rigor. But the guest list intrigued him. A Nobel laureate in physics would be there, a neuroscientist known for her work on perception, even a poet who'd written about quantum metaphors. Against his better judgment, he said yes. He arrived in a dark suit, clutching a leather notebook like armor. The house was modern but warm. Floor-to-ceiling windows, soft lighting, the smell of cedar and coffee in the air. Guests mingled in small clusters, glasses in hand, voices low and thoughtful. He recognized most faces from conferences or journals. Then he saw him. Keanu Reeves stood near a bookshelf, not holding a drink, just listening as a woman in a lab coat explained something about neural networks and quantum cognition. He nodded slowly, asked a question, and the scientist's eyes lit up, like someone had finally understood her point without needing it repeated 3 times. The professor froze. He hadn't expected to see him here. This wasn't a movie premiere or a charity gala. This was a room full of people who lived in the messy, beautiful space between disciplines. And somehow Reeves belonged. He tried to ignore it, joining a group discussing the limits of AI. But his attention kept drifting. He watched as Reeves moved from one conversation to another. Not dominating, not performing, just engaging. At one point, he was deep in discussion with the Nobel laureate about the role of observation in quantum mechanics. The physicist leaned in, gesturing with his hands, clearly not humoring him but genuinely debating. Then the host called everyone to the main room. "Let's talk about consciousness," he said. Not as a problem to solve, but as a mystery to explore. People settled into plush chairs. The conversation started gently. What is awareness? Can machines ever truly experience it? Then someone brought up quantum theories of mind, and the room tensed slightly. It's a controversial idea, often dismissed as fringe. But before anyone could shut it down, Reeves spoke. "I've always wondered," he said, voice calm but clear, "if the weirdness of quantum mechanics, like superposition or entanglement, might not just describe particles, but also point to something about how experience works. Not that the brain is a quantum computer necessarily, but that reality itself might be participatory. Like we're not just observing the universe, we're part of how it unfolds." Silence followed. Not the awkward kind, but the thoughtful kind. The kind that comes when someone says something simple that cracks open a door you didn't know was closed. Then the professor, unable to stop himself, interjected. "That sounds poetic," he said, crossing his arms, "but where's the evidence? Quantum effects get washed out at body temperature. Brains are wet, noisy places. Invoking quantum consciousness is like blaming ghosts for a power outage." A few people shifted uncomfortably, but Reeves didn't flinch. He looked at the professor, not with anger, but with the same quiet patience he'd shown in the lecture hall. "You're right about decoherence," he said. "And I'm not saying consciousness is quantum. But von Neumann and Wigner both suggested that measurement, observation, requires a conscious observer to collapse the wave function. That's not fringe. It's in the textbooks. The question isn't whether it's true, but why we're so quick to rule out the role of experience when the math itself leaves the door open." He paused, then added, "Science shouldn't fear mystery. It should lean into it." The Nobel laureate nodded slowly. "He's got a point. We've spent a century treating consciousness as an illusion to explain away. Maybe it's time we treated it as data." The professor sat back, stunned, not because he agreed, though part of him did, but because Reeves hadn't just regurgitated a YouTube video. He'd named names, cited interpretations, and framed the issue with nuance. This wasn't guesswork. This was study. This was care. For the rest of the evening, the professor watched. He saw how people gravitated toward Reeves, not for autographs, but for conversation. A young coder asked him about time and memory. A philosopher asked how grief shaped his view of permanence, and each time Reeves answered with honesty, humility, and depth. At one point, the host pulled the professor aside. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a smile. "I thought I knew what I was looking at," the professor admitted quietly. "Turns out I was wrong. Happens to the best of us," the host replied, "especially when we confuse titles with understanding." Later, as guests began to leave, the professor found himself near Reeves by the coat check. He didn't apologize, not yet. But he did something almost as rare for him. He asked a question. "What got you into all this?" He said, "Physics, I mean. Most people your age, well, they're not reading about wave function collapse." Reeves zipped up his jacket, thoughtful. "I guess I've always been trying to understand loss," he said simply. "When someone you love disappears, you start wondering, what is real? What lasts? Physics doesn't give answers, but it asks the right questions. And sometimes just asking helps." The professor didn't know what to say. He'd spent his life chasing equations, but this man had been chasing meaning, and somehow they'd ended up in the same place. They walked out together into the cool night. No more words were needed. The stars above were the same ones that had watched over Newton, Einstein, and every curious soul who ever looked up and wondered. And for the first time in years, the professor felt small. Not in a bad way, but in the way that makes you humble. Because genius, he realized, doesn't always wear a lab coat. Sometimes it wears a worn sweater, speaks softly, and carries the weight of the universe in its questions, not its answers. The days after the gathering passed slowly for the professor. He didn't sleep well. Not because he was troubled exactly, but because his mind kept circling back to that quiet conversation by the coat rack. The way the other man had spoken about loss. About physics not as a set of answers, but as a companion in grief. It was a perspective the professor had never considered. For him, science had always been a fortress against uncertainty, a place of clean logic and provable truths. But what if it could also be a place of comfort? Of connection? He started digging, not in a suspicious way, but with genuine curiosity. He pulled up old interviews, not the flashy talk show clips, but the quiet ones. The ones where cameras lingered a little longer, where questions went deeper. He found one from years ago, recorded in a dimly lit bookstore where the actor talked about time not as a line, but as something more like a wave. How the past never really leaves us, it just changes shape. He spoke about entropy, not as a physics term, but as a metaphor for how memories fade but never vanish. Then there was the story about Stephen Hawking. Not the photo op everyone saw, but the real moment. After a film premiere, instead of heading to the after-party, he'd stayed behind to talk with the physicist for nearly an hour. Staff had to gently remind them the venue was closing. They weren't discussing box office numbers or black holes as spectacle. They were talking about the nature of nothingness, and whether the universe needed a reason to exist. The professor also learned about the scholarships. Quietly, without press releases, the actor had been supporting students from underfunded schools who wanted to study science but couldn't afford it. Not just writing checks, but sometimes showing up, sitting with them over coffee, listening to their dreams, telling them it was okay to feel lost. As long as they kept asking questions, each discovery chipped away at the professor's old assumption. This wasn't a celebrity dabbling in smart talk to seem deep. This was someone who had carried a quiet, steady love for understanding, through fame, through personal tragedy, through years of being underestimated, and never let it go. One rainy afternoon, sitting in his office surrounded by books and half-finished equations, the professor did something he rarely did. He admitted he'd been wrong. Not out loud, not to anyone else, just to himself. And that admission opened a door. He remembered the lecture hall, the smirk, the dismissive wave of the hand. He thought about how easy it had been to judge someone based on their face, their job, their clothes. How he'd mistaken humility for ignorance, curiosity for pretense. In trying to protect the purity of science, he'd shut out someone who loved it just as much, maybe even more, because he didn't need it for a title or a salary. He pulled out his syllabus for next semester's graduate seminar on quantum foundations. For years it had been the same. Dense math, historical papers, debates between interpretations, but always from a purely technical angle. No room for the human side, no space for why any of it matters to people who aren't physicists. That night he rewrote the entire outline. He added a new section, Science and the Human Question. He included readings not just from Bohr and Heisenberg, but from poets, philosophers, even filmmakers who had grappled with the same mysteries. He planned a session on scientific humility, on how even the greatest minds have been wrong, and how progress often comes from listening to unexpected voices. He didn't do it to make amends, though part of him hoped it might count as one. He did it because he finally understood. Science isn't just about knowing. It's about wondering. And wonder belongs to everyone. Meanwhile, the other man was back on a film set thousands of miles away. Early mornings, long hours, the familiar rhythm of lights, cameras, action. Between takes, he sat in his trailer with a thermos of tea and a dog-eared copy of Carlo Rovelli's The Order of Time. He wasn't thinking about the professor, or the lecture, or even the gathering. He was thinking about a line he'd read that morning. Time is ignorance. It struck him, as it always did, because it felt true in his bones. Time isn't some grand river flowing past us. It's how we experience the limits of what we know. The past feels fixed because we remember it. The future feels open because we don't. But in the quantum world, maybe all moments exist at once, and it's only our consciousness that stitches them together into a story. He smiled to himself. That was the thing about physics. It never gave you final answers, but it gave you better questions. And better questions made you kinder somehow. Less certain, more curious. Less quick to judge. He thought about the young grad student who'd spoken to him after the lecture. He'd sent her a message weeks later, thanking her for not letting the moment die in silence. She'd replied with a photo of her classroom whiteboard, covered in equations they'd talked about. You inspired my students to ask weirder questions, she wrote. Thank you for showing them it's okay to wonder out loud. That meant more to him than any award. Back at the university, the professor began to change in small ways. He stopped interrupting students mid-question. He started saying I don't know when he didn't know, which surprised his class so much one student actually laughed. He even invited the grad student who'd spoken to Reeves to co-lead a discussion on science communication. She brought in clips of public figures talking about physics, some accurate, some wildly off, and they talked about how to correct misconceptions without shaming curiosity. One day, while cleaning out an old filing cabinet, he found a note he'd scribbled years ago during a conference. Genius is rare. Humility is rarer. He'd written it after hearing a talk by an elderly physicist who'd spent his life chasing a theory that never panned out, but who still spoke of it with joy. At the time, the professor had admired the dedication. Now he understood the humility. He taped the note to his office wall right above his desk. He still hadn't reached out directly. Not yet, maybe he never would. Some apologies don't need words, they live in the way you change. And he was changing, slowly, quietly, like a wave function collapsing into something new. Across the country, the actor finished his scene, handed the script back to the assistant, and walked toward his trailer. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. He paused for a moment, just looking. Somewhere, particles were entangled. Somewhere, a student was asking a question no one had thought to ask before. Somewhere, a professor was learning that intelligence wears many faces, and none of it needed an audience. It just needed to be true. Months had passed since the gathering on the hillside. Seasons turned. Leaves fell, snow came and went, and spring arrived with its usual quiet promise. The professor had settled into a new rhythm, not just in his teaching but in how he moved through the world. He still loved the precision of equations, the elegance of a clean proof, but now he also made space for the questions that couldn't be solved, only held. His revised course on quantum foundations had become one of the most talked about seminars on campus, not because it was easy, but because it felt human. Students said it was the first time they'd been encouraged to bring their whole selves into the room. Their doubts, their wonder, even their grief. One afternoon, he received an email about a small symposium on science communication. It wasn't flashy, no big sponsors, no media coverage, just a group of educators, writers, and thinkers gathered to talk about how to share complex ideas without stripping them of their soul. The keynote speaker, the message said, was someone unexpected but deeply thoughtful. The professor almost deleted it. He'd grown wary of celebrity science events. But then he saw the name, he didn't know what to expect. Part of him braced for performance, a polished speech full of rehearsed lines. But another part, the part that had been quietly reshaped over the past months, hoped for something real. The venue was a modest auditorium at a public library, the kind with creaky wooden floors and shelves that smelled like old paper. The room was half full. Teachers, librarians, a few curious locals, and a handful of students. No red carpet, no flashing lights. Just people who cared about ideas. Then he walked in. Keanu Reeves took the stage not with fanfare, but with the same quiet presence he'd shown in the lecture hall all those months ago. He wore a simple shirt, sleeves rolled up, and carried no notes, just a well-worn copy of a physics book tucked under his arm. He didn't start with a joke or a story about Hollywood. He started with a question. What if the biggest barrier to understanding science isn't the math, he said, but the belief that you have to be a certain kind of person to belong in it? He spoke for nearly 40 minutes, not as a star, but as a fellow traveler. He talked about how science had been a refuge for him during hard times, not because it gave answers, but because it honored the act of searching. He shared how he'd once been too shy to ask a question at a public talk, afraid of sounding foolish, and how that silence had stayed with him. Curiosity shouldn't require a resume, he said. It just requires courage, the kind it takes to say, I don't know, but I want to. He never mentioned the professor. Never brought up the insult, the lecture hall, the condescension. There was no score to settle. Instead, he spoke about the danger of equating titles with wisdom, about how real understanding often grows in silence and humility, in the willingness to listen more than you speak. When he finished, there was no roaring applause, just a long, respectful silence followed by warm, steady clapping. People didn't jump up for selfies. They stayed in their seats thinking. Afterward, as the audience trickled out, the professor stood near the back, unsure whether to approach. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to listen and maybe, just maybe, to begin something new. Reeves was packing his book into a canvas bag when he noticed the professor. Their eyes met. No tension, no awkwardness, just recognition. The professor walked over slowly. I came to hear you speak, he said simply. I'm glad you did, Reeves replied. A pause. Then the professor asked, what do you think about relational quantum mechanics? Rovelli's idea that properties aren't absolute, but defined only in relation to other systems? It wasn't an apology. It was an invitation. Reeves smiled, the same quiet smile from the oak tree outside the science building. I think it's beautiful, he said. It reminds me that nothing exists in isolation. Not particles, not people. We only know who we are through how we connect. They talked for nearly an hour right there in the emptying auditorium, about quantum reference frames, about how observation shapes reality, about the ethics of teaching. The professor asked questions. Reeves listened, then offered thoughts that were thoughtful, grounded, never showy. At one point, the professor admitted, I used to think rigor meant never showing doubt. Now I think rigor means being honest about how much we don't know. Reeves nodded. That's where the real work begins. Later, walking back to his car, the professor felt lighter than he had in years. Not because he'd been forgiven, he hadn't asked for it, but because he'd been met with grace. No grand gesture, no dramatic confrontation. Just two people, standing in the space between what was and what could be, choosing to move forward together. Back on set a week later, Reeves sat in his trailer during a break. Rain tapped gently on the roof. He opened his notebook to a fresh page and wrote, Understanding isn't about being right. It's about staying open. He underlined it twice. He thought about the conversation not with pride, but with gratitude. Not everyone gets a second chance to be seen for who they really are, and not everyone offers one. Meanwhile, in his office, the professor taped a new quote to his wall. This one from a letter Einstein once wrote. The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. Below it, in his own handwriting, he added, and the most dangerous thing is pretending we've solved it. The semester ended. Students handed in final papers filled with personal reflections alongside equations. One wrote, This class taught me it's okay to sit with uncertainty. Another said, I finally feel like I belong in science, even if I don't have all the answers. The professor read each one carefully. Then he closed his laptop, turned off the light, and walked out into the evening. Somewhere across the country, a man in a quiet trailer closed his book, sipped his tea, and looked out at the stars, knowing that somewhere, someone was asking a question, and that was enough. Because in the end, it was never about who was smarter or more famous. It was about who was willing to stay curious, who was willing to listen, and who remembered that every great discovery began with a simple, humble phrase, "I wonder."